It's a mysterious world, the past. We were there, we know it happened, but we can't ever truly look back with clarity. We remember the high school LAN nights and local comps, but we conveniently don't remember the smell. We recall long nights and early mornings with siblings playing classics, and we miss those perfect moments, but we forget the screaming and crying that ensued when someone eventually lost too many times and started throwing controllers. The past, and our nostalgia alongside it, exist in this seemingly unobservable quantum space. All these memories exist, but every time you try to recall them and something changes, things are missing or added. In the end, the full truth of it remains a black box. You never get the full picture. It's why game preservation matters. It preserves the sense of truth about things, reminds you why you still love the things that you do, or serves as demonstration for how much you've changed if you don't. But here's the frustrating part. Even with games, movies, everything else really, all these great experiences are plagued by the same curse as your precious memories. You can boot them up right now, but as soon as you do, as soon as you observe, your observation changes things. You're older now. You've seen new things, had new influences, and your once precious perfection evaporates right when you try to catch a glimpse. It may not be much, maybe not enough to change opinions, but something is always different, even if slightly. This Schrodinger's box of nostalgia is unavoidable when looking back at the games of yesteryear, save for one silver bullet: ignorance. See, what I mean is that it's a special opportunity to go back to the past with new eyes. Find appreciation without the influence of nostalgia to sway your expectations and hopes too low or too high. In my experience, it's the games that can stand the test of time, make great impressions on new generations of people, and stand tall without the shoulders of nostalgia to carry them, that are truly special. Gather together as many review scores as you'd like, but in my opinion, time is the ultimate judge. Whether it's fair or not, the question of is this game still worth playing today? That's the ultimate question. That's the standard that we hold things to. Valve's 2004 release Half-Life 2 is that special kind of game. It's not just good for its time. It's not just good if you shift perspectives and account for the old standards of the early 2000s. It's just good.
The right man in the wrong place can make all the difference in the world. So wake up, Mr. Freeman. Wake up and smell the ashes.
It's difficult to start a video like this, mainly because of the topic at hand. Half-Life 2, whether or not you appreciate it or otherwise, has had a lasting impact on the direction of the industry, and influenced many contemporaries of today, especially in more recent years with the indie scene, which stands as a creative cornerstone amidst the tide of boardroom vomit. It's why before going in and even playing this game for the first time, I already had a lot of respect for it, born purely out of its influence on an era that I grew up with. On the one hand, I went into this wanting to do this game justice for the sake of its many fans and the influence that it had. But on the other, my respect isn't blind admiration. And the greatest game of all time, for me, Half-Life 2 just isn't that. In my previous video, I threw a lot of my criticisms in the bucket of, well, the game has aged and time has not been kind to many of its design philosophies that we adopted before alternatives were found. Perhaps the greatest accomplishment of Half-Life 2 is that despite 20 years, it doesn't feel this same way. Through clever design and visuals far ahead of its time, Half-Life 2 has managed to avoid, at least in my eyes, the often inescapable reality of time. But this really is a double-edged sword though, because despite the huge positives of that timelessness, there's no longer a convenient bucket to throw criticisms into. I don't like everything about this game. And the things that I don't like are the sort of things that I wouldn't have enjoyed now, 10 years ago, or ever. It's a strange thing to say, but I believe that the game's negatives are just as timeless as its positives. I think it's best to start with the positives though, because make no mistake, this is a good game. A great game, actually, and in so many different ways. I mentioned previously that Half-Life 1 has a lot of DNA hovering around in more modern immersive sims, and that's true. But I think Half-Life 2's influence is a much more obvious one. But thinking about the years between 2008 and 2016, there really wasn't a whole lot in the mainstream at least, that explored that space. It seems to point to Half-Life 2 being truly far ahead of its time, similar to the first but dramatically more so. I believe this was in no small part due to the fact that a lot of the major developments in the game's physics were first implemented in Valve's Source engine. One of the most impressive feats of this game, its custom physics, was, aside from very basic implementations carried over from Half-Life 1's Gold Source, new ground for game engines. It makes sense that after going through all the painstaking effort to implement a far more robust physics system, that one of Source Engine's debut games would be designed in a way that takes full advantage of it. Modern games inherited a lot of this early work in physics, and when we now think of Unreal, Unity, Godot, etc., this kind of stuff is just par for the course, which I would imagine puts it less in the forefront of developers and designers' minds when creating a game. Physics was really in the forefront for much of the game's stronger levels, and I'll touch on this more later, but I feel that experience was at its best when designing around this strong point of the game and the engine. The game's stronger levels follow a formula that I maintain is an excellent way to structure a game: the semi-open world. The thing I love about the semi-open world is that it provides the perfect means to strike a balance between detail and scale. You may recall if you watched my video on Half-Life 1 that one of the central design considerations of an immersive sim is this balancing act. Too small and there's too little room for exploration and awe, too large and you lose the finer details that make this genre so engaging to begin with. Half-Life 2's strongest levels and moments to me were the ones that struck this balance perfectly. It's in this area where I think the second entry elevates itself the most from the original. Levels in Half-Life 2 are open-ended, reward curiosity and exploration, but not so much that the pacing suffers. Most of the levels, with exception to parts that I'll touch on later, hit just the right amount of freedom, balanced with just the right amount of direction and purpose to keep things interesting moment to moment. I can't make a definitive claim since this was slightly before when I started gaming, but I wouldn't be surprised if this balance is also what made Halo as successful as it was too, it being one of the few direct competitors at the time. Whether it was intentional or just out of necessity from technical limitations at the time, both of those games had this balance in place and were all the better for it. Ironically, in the years following, there seemed to be an obsession with the scale part. And it's only now that we've reached a point where technologically, where scale has gotten completely out of control, that developers and players are beginning to rethink what they value in a product. The result being that we're slowly and gently floating back to how things were back when Half-Life 2 released.
Oh my god. The Citadel.
Major fracture.
It's time for a little brutal honesty here though. Things fell a little short for me in the setting and narrative department, which is a shame because it's one of the stronger points of the original in my opinion. The narrative of the first game struck a neat balance between confusion and direction. It molded that combination into an intriguing world and plot, where although I didn't know everything going on, I knew enough to be compelled to press on and find the mysteries. The second game missteps here because it skewed more towards confusion for me. There was such a tone shift going from 1 to 2, so much added lore and world building that you're just dumped right into. The Combine and these many new characters seem to have prior established relationship with Gordon, the G-Man, the situation with the Vortigons, City 17's dystopian regime. It was all a lot to take in after getting straight off the train. It's not that any of this stuff isn't interesting, or that it's in need of some ham-fisted dump of exposition. It's more that I felt like I was dropped into a world midway through the plot, as if things had already developed and come to a boiling point. Maybe that was the intention, but intentions don't make a story more enjoyable. I felt the same confusion as I did with the first game, but it was less mysterious and compelling. Instead, there was always a feeling of every plot development that I'm missing an important piece of context or world building. I was too in the dark to be compelled by the new mysteries and developments that presented themselves as the game progressed. I think part of the reason this felt so much different to me is that Half-Life 2 takes a much different approach to storytelling than its predecessor. This isn't a mysterious sci-fi thriller that relies on subtle visual storytelling. This is an epic. It has multiple intermingling characters and arcs, different factions, each with their own unique situations and developments, and these characters are strong, likable, and well written. Their interaction with each other and responses to the world around them help really sell a world and plot that, without their presence, would be a convoluted mess. Two standouts for me were Alex's emotion and humor throughout the game, which was a nice juxtapose to the depressing backdrop,
Come on, Gordon, crank that thing.
and the persistent ramblings of primary antagonist Wallace Breen. His calm demeanor and well-spoken language masking the unhinged tirades about human nature and our higher purpose, and propping up Gordon as some form of demonic antichrist as things begin to unravel around him. But despite strong characters, this feeling of never quite feeling like I understand enough was holding me back from getting fully invested into this world in the same way that I was with the first entry. I made a real, genuine attempt to piece things together as much as I could, and I think for the most part that I did. But that process wasn't as exciting, because this new focus on characters and relationships, despite being good, also meant that often events would be discussed openly and things would develop and change fast, leaving me feel like I was left somewhere behind. Half-Life 1's plot development was discovered more than it was delivered. Things revealed themselves to the character as they were revealed to you, and because of that, the mystery was more satisfying to solve. This tonal shift extends to visuals as well. Maybe I'm just used to the Source engine at this point, but Half-Life 2 feels like a bit of a stylistic step back and shift in tone from Half-Life 1. Something about it just felt drier and browner, perhaps more reflective of the era that it released in than anything. The dystopian scene was compelling at first, sure, but it's a tone I've seen many times before, albeit that may be partly due to the influence that this game has had on other games. Despite that though, Half-Life 1 felt more unique in its tone. The sequel is clearly the winner when it comes to fidelity of, well, everything. Just look at it. Character textures and animations I'd say are the most obvious leap and bound, breathing so much life into an otherwise dry and dead-looking landscape. There are moments where Half-Life 2 takes advantage of its improvements. When it throws a few different colors onto the palette that aren't brown and gray, the results are impressive. It just doesn't do that all that often. It's a lot of brown and gray concrete, which does suit the game's tone and setting, but that fact doesn't make it any easier on the eyes. Textures and lighting are also far better. But now that both games have RTX updates that bring them up to today's standards anyway, that's a fact that's of less importance than artistic style and good use of color, in my opinion. One thing that does very much suit this game, though, is this. The gravity gun has got to be one of the coolest guns, one of the coolest mechanics in any game ever. I've played games with similar mechanics before, but it's never felt this good. The gravity gun doesn't just pick stuff up and throw it around, it launches it. It wouldn't really matter if the rest of the game was hot garbage. Levitating a brick and then shotgunning it into a zombie's head, watching it fly back into the wall as if it was being belted by a semi-truck, is enough to carry a game on its own. More than just being fun, it forces a different approach to fights. Having the option of flinging a chair that allows me to get a quick kill and conserve ammo compelled me to keep an eye out for my surroundings, and rewarded my quick thinking far more than an accurate or well-timed shot from a gun could. Bugbait had that same catharsism. After spending a fair chunk of the game harassed by these bastard antlions, having the tables turn and commanding my antlion army to endlessly barrage enemies was a satisfying power trip. These kind of games are at their best when they give you the freedom and incentive to engage with the flexibility that the developers worked so painstakingly hard to offer. When Half-Life 2 gave me that freedom and that incentive both through use of these mechanics and varied traversal, that's when it showed me why it was considered one of the greatest games of all time. Pretty easy to guess then what my favorite level was. Ravenholm. To me, this level best illustrates Half-Life 2 at its strongest. It's a tonal shift away from City 17's standard dystopia, leaning more into the horror of the setting. Its design features interesting physics-based traversal and traps that encourage heavy use of the game's best weapon, and its short side story presents a compelling mystery that brought back a little bit about what I enjoyed about the first game. There's plenty of levels I really liked. The game had far more good than bad when it came to levels, but Ravenholm is where things really clicked for me, and the strengths of Half-Life 2 and its Source engine made themselves most known. There were other great examples of the game really playing to its strengths. Highway 17 with its great sense of freedom and scale, sand traps for that antlion power trip I mentioned, among a few other notables. These were really strong points of the game, and in moments like these I was absolutely hooked. But nothing's perfect, except for Outer Wilds, so inevitably there were some levels that fell short for me. These were almost exclusively the ones that relied too much on the generic gunplay experience that reduced the sense of freedom and experimentation for the sake of set pieces, drama, or just plain padding. I don't think the set pieces or climactic moments of drama were all that bad, but I did often wonder why entire levels had to sit around them, that featured nothing but corridor shooting. I felt this most when transitioning from Half-Life's main game to its much weaker DLC companion, Half-Life 2 Chapter 1. Chapter 1 starts out strong with the Citadel. The gravity gun is back immediately and still remains that powered up organic version from the base game's finale. A few new puzzles are thrown in as Gordon and Alex make their way down from the crumbling wreck of the Citadel, but as soon as we get back to City 17, that's when things start to really shift away. It's at this point I feel that Chapter 1 best illustrates the parts that I don't like about Half-Life 2. That being the moments where City 17 descends into chaos and the game takes a step back from the wider world, instead opting to jam you into wall-to-wall corridor shooting. Don't mistake me here, I'm not actually opposed to some quality corridor shooting, but I feel like the game has sometimes relied too much on its comparatively weak gunplay when it had so many other great ideas to work with. I use comparatively very intentionally here. When I say comparatively weak, I'm not making the comparison between it and other shooters of the time, although comparing it to Halo is a bit of a tough one. I actually enjoy the gunplay of both Half-Life 1 and 2, it's decent enough and it gets the job done, but it isn't this game's strongest element, and it's not memorable. If someone were to tell me that they love shooters and tight gameplay, my mind wouldn't be going straight to Half-Life 2 as a recommendation. It's not a shooter, it's much more than that, which is why it's frustrating that some sections of the game seemed hell-bent on not playing to its strengths and instead devolving into large, semi-decent shooting galleries. Thankfully, the conclusive, or should I say inconclusive, Chapter 2 really brings back the strengths with super impressive levels. White Forest and Vortal Coil were some of the strongest in the whole series. White Forest in particular was a nice breath of fresh air from Chapter 1's weaknesses. Visually striking with a refreshing color palette and open-ended explorative structure present in the base game. But for every White Forest or Ravenholm, it felt like there was also a Nova Prospect or an Urban Flight or Escape 17, which just didn't quite hit the same way.
Odessa Cubbage at your service.
In the end though, I think the best way I can articulate my thoughts on Half-Life 2 is that it's unapologetically bold. Everything about it is a bold move. The shift away from Quake's DNA into the Source engine, the grander level design to complement new tech, and the bigger, more epic character-focused narrative. Not all of this boldness pays off for me personally, and some of the charm of the predecessor gets lost on the way. But despite that, it's the boldness that makes this game what it is. It's boldness that placed it so far ahead of its time, and what's in this package is not only excellent for 2 decades ago, it's excellent for here and now. It's tough to know what the future holds for this franchise. Alex remains a reminder of what's possible when AAA devs are willing to take the VR risk, and from tiny amounts of hours I've played of it, it seems like a good fit for the franchise. But a fully fledged mainline VR Half-Life? I doubt that's a financial gamble Valve are willing to take. We aren't in 2004 anymore, and the industry has benefited and suffered from tectonic shifts that shake the very foundation of how games are made and the risks they can and can't take. But whatever form the continuation of this franchise takes, whether it's Half-Life 3 or something else, I truly hope that, against all odds, it's as unapologetically risk-taking as before. Until then, it's pleasing to exist in the future where this game had the influence that it had, and I can enjoy the games directly inspired and built on the foundation that it sets. Like, I don't know, Psychonauts or something.